Well, thank you everyone as we get set up. I know we're a little bit pressed for time. I just want to first start by thanking Josh, Julia, Kim, and their very hardworking staff for a really excellent excellent day of discussion. So thank you so much for that. A key takeaway from today is how the geoeconomic toolkit available to governments across the Atlantic has rapidly expanded, for good or evil, over the last several years. And collectively, we need to determine how and when to use such tools responsibly. Nowhere are the trade-offs associated with the reality that fragmentation in the name of security involves trade-offs. Nowhere are these trade-offs more apparent than in industrial policy and supply chain resilience. We've talked around this issue throughout the panels today, normally by people mentioning the IRA, but we're going to face this head on in this last session before Ambassador Tai. It's not surprising that this particular area is of a special concern given the inherent distributive consequences of restructuring supply chains. And the fact that when we talk about trade policy, normally trade policy is the outcome of multiple policy objectives that are often explicitly in tension with one another. So this last panel is going to try to address these contradictions head on and think about how all of the different types of policies that we've discussed over the course of today integrate, or the extent to which they cohere. So we have a fantastic slate of panelists to help us through this. I'd like to welcome to the stage now Beth Baltzan, who is a senior advisor to the U.S. Trade Representative, Anahita Thoms, who heads Baker McKenzie's international trade practice in Germany, and joining us remotely, Denis Redonnet, who is the Deputy Director General and Chief Trade Enforcement Officer in the Directorate General for Trade in the European Commission. So hopefully you're up on, okay, thank you, Denis. So let's just get into it right away. So Deputy Director General, let's begin with you. You are the EU's first Chief Trade Enforcement Officer. Can you tell us more about what your position tells us about the EU's evolving approach to issues of geoeconomics, economic security, and trade policy? How do those go together?
Okay, so look, thank you very much. Very happy to be participating in the forum in this panel. Thank you for having me. I think the concerns and the focus we're putting on geoeconomics and economic security are growing. We are doing this now on the EU side much more affirmatively, and as you perhaps know, and I'm sure we'll come to this in the discussion, the European Commission has actually adopted in June a sort of policy statement, a sort of policy white paper to frame that approach to economic security and in a sense, our sense of how we position in geoeconomics. But I think that there are different dimensions to this. The first actually precedes the whole question of how we deal with the articulation between geopolitics and international economic relations. That is a big area of policy development. But even before we get to that, we have wanted for several years now to put much more focus on, I would say, more classical elements of our trade, investment, and international economic policies in the sense of ensuring more effective implementation, where necessary, enforcement of our trade agreements, of our trade arrangements, in order to ensure that first and foremost our economic policy tools, such as the EU trade policy, actually delivers benefits that they are supposed to deliver. It's a question of legitimacy, it's a question of acceptability of an open market strategy based on rules. We have to make sure that when we negotiate trade agreements, we make good on that and our partners make good on them. So that's level one, if you want. Level two is indeed the fact that we have to understand and accept that there is a change in paradigm that's taking place, that alongside drivers relating to efficiency, we have to take into account questions relating to risk and resilience of our economic interactions with the rest of the world. We have to take into account the fact that there is a sort of hard re-entry of hard geopolitics in our international and economic relations. In Europe, obviously, we have seen that, not least through the effects and the consequences of Russia's war of aggression on Ukraine, and accept that generally speaking, there is an excess of issues around trade, technology, and essential security, which require us to basically develop at EU level our policy toolkit, which we are doing through our economic security strategy. So that is a bit, if you want, the sort of two-legged approach that we have to these questions, and some of the things that myself and many colleagues in the Trade Department of the European Commission are putting their efforts on right now.
Okay, so Denis focuses on the importance of implementing trade agreements to deliver benefits of open markets. Beth, I'd like to ask you to step in here in a slightly different way, because the Office of the USTR traditionally negotiates US trade agreements, but we all know that the Biden administration, as the Trump administration before it, is not particularly interested in new trade deals at the moment. So how does your office see its role in the kind of development, as what Denis said, is this paradigm shift to a basically governments expecting trade to do more or do different things in society?
Thanks so much, and thanks for having me here. This is actually the 60th anniversary of the agency that would become USTR. USTR was created by Congress because Congress was frustrated that some of our domestic priorities were being sacrificed for foreign policy interests, and they wanted us to be able to focus on the well-being of workers and American businesses and have better balance. And so USTR is an interagency coordinator, Treasury, State, Labor, Agriculture, Commerce. Just to pick up on a couple of points. First, I think we actually are negotiating trade deals. So we have the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework. We have an undertaking in the Americas, a negotiation with Kenya, and also a negotiation with Taiwan. And I think Ambassador Tai at MC12 was part of a range of agreements at the WTO. I think, to be honest, the Trump administration did negotiate the more traditional free trade agreements, which is, I think, what people mean by trade agreements, which is, why aren't we doing tariff liberalization? So I think that's actually the question. And just to pick up on something Denis was saying, we're focused, it's a paradigm shift, and we're focused on risk and resilience. If you're going to have trade agreements that promote risk and resilience, you've got to look at the details of those agreements and make sure they're serving those interests. The way we did trade agreements prior to the change in paradigm, prior to the pandemic, prior to the Russian invasion of Ukraine, was based on an efficiency approach, where you just sort of wanted to maximize the amount of goods that could circulate duty-free. And in particular, the industrial rules in those trade agreements tended to allow a lot of content from non-parties to those agreements. If what we want to do is promote diversification, do a better job of promoting resilient supply chains, then we need to make sure those rules are fit for purpose. And the rules are like this thick. It's not for the faint of heart. So there's actually just work to do if what we want to do is deliver on the promise of having more diverse, more resilient supply chains.
So to just briefly follow up on that point, so in traditional trade agreements, we might measure effectiveness by how it changes how the trade agreement changes the effective tariff rate. But what you're talking about is something that's much more complex. So how do you determine, whether a agreement that you're negotiating is really going to help to create more resilience in supply chains? And I'll want you to answer that and then pass it over to Anahita to talk a little bit more about how firms and her clients are thinking about these issues.
Sure. I think what we see is, we saw with the pandemic and the Russian invasion of Ukraine that we had very, very concentrated supply chains. So I think people are saying we need to diversify away from that. How do we get more diversification? And I think people reach for, we should do trade agreements with friendly partners. And that's going to give us diversification. That's why it's so important to understand how the rules actually work. Because if the rules aren't actually promoting integration among those parties, you haven't diversified. And that's why the supply chain rules in these agreements are so critical. So just to emphasize, when we were having a lot of debates around trade in 2015, there were a lot of people who said, you know, tariffs are passé, we don't need to worry about that, average tariff rates are very low, it's all the behind the border stuff. So it's a little bit of whiplash for me to be in this position now and to hear, it's all about the tariffs. What you're doing doesn't count. All this behind the border stuff doesn't count if you're not doing tariffs. And I think we've got to sort of have a better, more rational conversation about what the purpose of trade agreements is and how we want to make sure they serve the purpose we want them to serve.
Anahita, how about you jump in with the kind of compliance and private sector view here?
Sure. So when we look at our clients, what we see are challenges, and we can distinguish between three pillars. First is the factual, right? The diversification we talked about, the de-risking, the digitalization that is needed to get more resilient supply chain. The second pillar is the legal framework, the landscape. And the third I would add is, which is of course intertwined, is the reputational angle to it. So anything that goes beyond the law that many of the companies want to comply with, although they don't have to. So we have talked a lot about the first pillar. Let me talk a little bit about the second pillar. There are multiple things that are important from a company's perspective, especially Germany is an export nation, and we are really dependent on being certain when we invest somewhere, when we have these super complex supply chains with 10,000s of sub-suppliers, that we can rely on certain investments that we are making. So one thing is certainty that the rules are applied, but also that we don't wake up every day to a new set of rules and have to comply with more complex rules overnight. And the third thing that I would add from a regulatory perspective is the layers over layers of complexity, but the lack of interaction with the companies. So I've seen a lot of roundtables when I lived in New York where the government talked to representatives of companies. I hope that we do that more in Germany as well. So there are things that we can learn from the US where new economic sanctions come in, sit down with the representatives of the companies and talk to them. The guidance, when we look at the German Supply Chain Act, for example, the guidance should not come months in after the law has been passed. It has to go hand in hand, because it's not that the companies argue the fact that we have responsibilities as companies and representatives of companies, but the way things are done, the unclarity of the law, and that the guidance sometimes takes months and months to come. And then the last thing that I would add to that is, if we pass a law in Germany, how much impact does it have? And we see that with the German Supply Chain Act, where the companies have really tried a lot to comply with it. And now the discussion is around the EU law, the CSDDD. And suddenly in Germany, we're discussing whether we should stop and wait until the EU law is enacted. I think it should be the other way around. We have to push forward the EU legislation. We have to push forward for more human rights resilience in the supply chain, but at the same time, we have to be very careful of not overwhelming our companies.
So let's stick with this about the legal framework and how this creates uncertainty. So one of the things that's, I think, a particular challenge right now is that as there's a push within governments to find ways to restructure supply chains either through regulation or through incentives, that we're doing this in an incredibly complex geopolitical environment. We have had a series of major shocks to the system, and we also have a lot of uncertainty about where all of this is going to land. So from the perspective of your clients, how much is this uncertainty making it hard to actually restructure those supply chains? And what do your clients need in order to make those long-term investments into the future?
I think what we have heard in the previous panel is indeed that clients do not really question whether we need a law and whether sometimes the laws have to be passed very quickly, but it's more the clarity around what do you actually want, and then the guidance that has to come along with the law. So the constant, I tell you this is what I meant, instead of, this is the law, you have to comply with it. So that's one element. I think the second element is, if a law is enacted, try to find as many to make the law impactful so that the clients really understand why they have to comply with so many laws, what impact does it really have. And I think to just give very concrete examples. Now we're talking about the outbound screening, right? The minister talked about it. If we look at it, and he repeated the sentence, we should not be naive. I mean, we're saying that for many, many years. We should never be naive. But for many, many years, 2018, to give you clear numbers, 2018 in Germany, we only had 78 investment screening reviews. I'm not talking about prohibitions or restrictions, just 78. 2022, we had 306. Only 2% of them were restricted. Doesn't mean that they were all prohibited, but some of them were prohibited. Most of them were just subject to certain conditions. Which means if you talk a lot about restrictions, you of course have an effect on investors. Investors start questioning whether they should be investing in Germany if there are so many layers of bureaucratic nightmare, and then maybe the transaction doesn't go through. So we have to remain investor-friendly without being naive, which means the laws are the laws, they have to be complied with. At the same time, we need to really lessen the bureaucratic nightmare that we have in Germany.
So, Denis, I want to turn back to you. First, to think a little bit about, at the Commission level, how you're thinking about policy coherence and how to communicate more clearly, as Anahita has mentioned, firms need with these investors and industry so that they can make these long-term decisions. So could you talk a little bit, you mentioned in your opening remarks a little bit about the recent Commission's economic security strategy. So can you help us understand that strategy really focused quite a bit on the role of the importance of this supply chain resilience through an economic security lens. So what tools does that open up to the Commission versus member states, and how do you see your role in trying to make this process, make these tools cohere in order to encourage these long-term investments that we need the firms to make?
Mm-hmm. Look, I think that the economic security strategy is essentially about giving ourselves a tool to adequately proportionally de-risk where there is a need to de-risk. It starts, by the way, from making the proper diagnostic about our vulnerabilities. Some of these supply chain dependencies and vulnerabilities, notably on the industrial supply chain side. Now, on this is not work that has started yesterday. For several years now, governments, European governments, national governments, and the European Commission are engaged into trying to identify properly what are the real zones of vulnerability in the sense of dependencies that potentially can be, in a more geopolitical world, weaponized. We know that this is not a huge part of the European economy or of our trade and investment relationships. 3 years ago, 2 years ago now, in the context of the review of the EU's industrial strategy, we did produce a first cut assessment of those supply chain vulnerabilities for important industrial ecosystems. What does that show? Well, it shows, if you look at our trade dependency, that there is a very limited number of products where we have a situation of very high concentration, dependency on imports or exports in these sensitive ecosystems, and where this creates a vulnerability because there is a very low potential for diversification. Diversification remains, of course, the main de-risking tools that we have in trade policy, therefore plays a tool there, but where we have limited potential for diversification or limited possibility for substitution with domestic production. But if you take that zone or that universe, which is really the zone where you have potentially vulnerabilities coming from interdependencies or dependencies of an economic nature, we're talking here about something which is less than or about 0.5% of our total extra EU imports. So it's a limited subset of our international economic relations that we're talking about. There, of course, on that zone, there's a question about what to do and how you de-risk that part of your vulnerabilities, or how do you increase the resilience of the supply chains in that zone. The first thing is that a lot of this is going to have to be, in any case, market-based and market-driven, because there is inevitably going to be a repricing and reassessment of risk by private economic operators in a market economy. And that, I think, is already happening to a large extent. Second, where need be, public authorities do step in. And at the EU, it's a combination of our central level and national authorities given the allocation of competence, where we try to go further in identifying risk and developing risk mitigation strategies. That is what the economic security strategy of the Commission proposes to do in the coming months. And right now, the European Commission is engaged in a set of risk assessment and risk mitigation exercise for industrial supply chains, for emerging tech, for critical infrastructure, and develop, where necessary, the toolbox. We have an existing toolbox on the trade and investment side. We have level playing field instruments of a traditional nature. We have level playing field instrument of a somewhat more novel nature. I'm thinking, for example, about the European Union level statute that has come on the books, which would enable us to deal with the distortive effect of foreign subsidies in the internal market. So foreign subsidies that come through foreign direct investment, for example. And we have a system of trade and investment control tools, export controls, controls on investment where necessary for public order and security, which we are upgrading from a European perspective. We started with inward investment control, where we now have in force for several years a coordination mechanism to deal with these issues when they concern the single market as a whole, where they concern more than one national member states. And we are going to be looking in the next few months at the question of how to deal with the European dimension of tools such as export controls and perhaps outbound investment screening, indeed, from the point of view of one issue, which is a real issue for our economic security and our essential security interests, which is the risk of leakage of, in particular, emerging digital technologies that are ubiquitous in nature, because these are technologies that can actually be channeled to the military side through civil military fusion strategies in a number of destinations of concern. So these are things where you see that the trade, tech, and security nexus is coming to the forefront, and that will be part of the mix of policy developments that is going to be looked at in the next few months.
So just to follow up on that, recently it was announced that the EU has started an anti-subsidy investigation into Chinese electric vehicles, and I'm just curious, as the EU builds out these different tools, because you have developed a very robust toolkit here in a short period of time, how do you see the coherence behind this kind of anti-foreign subsidies or subsidy investigation for foreign entities when indeed the EU itself and member states are starting to engage in trying to build out their own industrial policy around the exact same technologies and items?
Well, look, you referred to the decision to initiate an anti-subsidy investigation on the imports of electric vehicles from China. This is basically us having recourse to well-established level playing field tools, trade contingency measures, when we are faced with injurious subsidization. We have a situation, unfortunately, where the global trade rulebook probably disciplines industrial subsidization to the extent that that has bigger than ever effects or spillover effects in international trade. That system of disciplining is probably not as developed as we want it to be, but there are a number of remedy measures and remedy tools that are available when the conditions for that are met, and we use our tool in an extremely disciplined and rules-based manner. We will use some of these tools. That is what we are doing with the initiation of an investigation here, as we are using, I would say, our traditional level playing field tools in other sectors as well. But I think I'd like to point out maybe several things. One is that as we develop this toolbox, which relates to beefing up our economic security, we do it on the basis of a number of principles. Number one, we have these tools are firmly anchored in our international commitments. Number two, we want to have a doctrine of use, which is a doctrine of use based on necessity and proportionality. Number three, we want to partner. The economic security strategy that the Commission has put forward is based on three pillars: promote, protect, and partner. And the third P, partner, is not an afterthought. We will not do this in isolation from the rest of the world, in isolation from our trading partners, and we need to develop mechanisms to do so. This is why we believe, by the way, that an active trade policy, such as the one that we are taking forward in the EU with an agenda of negotiation of trade agreements, as well as the development of new forms of engagement beyond traditional trade agreements. By the way, and I echo here what Beth was saying, there are other ways to interact and deploy our international economic relations beyond traditional FTAs. With the United States, for example, we have an instrument called the Trade Technology Council, which is to be put to use, which is not a traditional trade agreement, but which can serve the purpose of greater regulatory convergence between two big blocks. We need to put all this to use in order for us to have an economic security strategy, which is not closed, inward-looking, but which is precisely trying to maximize the benefits of continuing to partner with countries across the globe. So these are a bit the principles, if you want, or the elements that will guide us going forward in the rollout and implementation of this shift towards the introduction of an element of security in the logic that underpins the way we organize our international economic relations.
Thank you. So, Beth, I want to give you a little bit of time here on the stage too, because the EU's way of dealing with these issues is oftentimes to talk about this through an economic security frame for reasons that have to do with competence. Economic security means something a bit different in the US context. So maybe you could talk a little bit about how USTR is thinking about these issues and a worker-centered trade policy, particularly, given that I think many who are maybe a little bit further afield from the US would say that this is just a form of protectionism.
Yeah, happy to address that. So we are pursuing a worker-centered trade policy, and we are clear that part of that is making sure we're providing economic security for working people. That is something that was in Ambassador Tai's Labor Day statement. I think sometimes we forget, we've gotten used to thinking of labor as a side issue when it comes to trade, but labor is a factor of production, just as capital is a factor of production. The original vision for Bretton Woods had enforceable labor rules in it because they understood the risk of the race to the bottom in a liberalizing, interdependent economy. We've really got to be mindful that if you don't take care of your workers, that you're putting your democracy at risk. And yesterday President Biden had an agreement with President Lula about workers' rights all over the world. So it's not about U.S. workers versus other workers. It's really about making sure that we orient our economy towards everyday people, including working people.
So can you tell us then how that will guide USTR kind of moving forward, and how we might think about how USTR thinks about industrial policy in the US, and then how that relates to supply chain resilience outside the US? As Minister Hebach mentioned earlier, dealing with supply chain resilience only internally is, I think he used the word crazy. Right? So can you kind of create some coherence for us here?
Yeah, in the report is a reference to the erosion of the core belief in the wisdom of market fundamentalism, which is a really powerful phrase and captures, I think, a little bit of what Denis, perhaps if I could suggest that's a little bit of what we mean by when we say there's a paradigm shift. I think it's really important to understand that the version of globalization we had for the 40 years was oriented a little bit along the free market ideology, where you didn't have guardrails. You didn't have protections for labor. As I say, that was part of the original vision for Bretton Woods. You didn't have anti-monopoly rules. Anti-monopoly rules, that was part of the original vision for Bretton Woods for the trade rules. So you had a system that was very laissez-faire in orientation. If we understand the unique role of the US economy in that construct, that US tariffs were lower than the tariffs of other major economies, that also goes back to 1948, that the US has had an open economy, and when people talk about export-led growth, we should understand that a lot of those exports were destined for the United States. So the United States experienced deindustrialization in a very, very acute way under this laissez-faire construct. If we are trying to move away from a laissez-faire construct towards something that is closer to the original vision of Bretton Woods for the United States, we should remember that the people negotiating thought for us were New Dealers. If that's what we want to do, then industrial policy is in part corrective for the 40 years of atrophy based on that particular version of globalization.
So we have just over 10 minutes, and I want to have an opportunity for people to ask questions. But where I wanted to take this panel is to spend a little bit of time talking about global governance over these issues. I mean, it's quite striking that we've spent 30 minutes talking about trade policy, industrial policy, and I don't think that we've mentioned the WTO once. Right? So I'll start by just down the line. I'd like to hear from each of you, maybe starting with Beth and ending with Denis, on kind of how you see, what's a path forward towards some kind of multilateral or plurilateral pathway forward to ensure that we don't get just subsidy races and those that can afford high levels of subsidization get all of the investment in these kind of core labor, job-producing investments?
I'll start. So I will be, to be fair, I did mention the WTO. I mentioned some of the agreements that we were able to achieve. But I think it's really important because, again, there was a lot of push for the Biden administration to engage at the WTO. We have engaged at the WTO, but nobody seems to be noticing. So that is also perhaps a little bit of frustration. In a time of change where you do need a new version of globalization, how do you achieve that in an organization that is 164 members and operates on the basis of consensus? So there are conversations that are ongoing. I do think we can see some of these other negotiations, plurilateral or bilateral, as opportunities to innovate. So global arrangement is one of the initiatives we have with the European Union to try to address some of the challenges. How do you move towards green production of steel and aluminum? And how do you address this in the face of non-market excess capacity that the WTO didn't contemplate or really think about how to address? Again, a difference from the way the original vision from Bretton Woods was oriented.
Oh, Denis, do you want to go? And then Anahita?
Sure. Well, I think from our perspective is that the governance framework for all this is to operate at different levels. I mean, first, it's true that we do operate through our own instruments, developing our own autonomous toolbox where necessary. By the way, I would agree with what was said before, that when we're talking about resilience of supply chains, well, for us, resilient supply chains are sustainable supply chains as well. So this is why, for example, when it comes to sustainability conditions, whether it's on the environmental side or the labor side, we pay a lot of attention to this through our trade policy settings. So provisions relating to this in our ambitious agenda of trade agreement negotiations, and where necessary, through a number of autonomous statutes that have an impact on the way in which the conditions of trade operate and whether we are introducing sustainability in our international economic relations. I'm thinking about a statute such as our deforestation legislation, proposal that is on the table with respect to forced labor and a marketing prohibition of forced labor in the internal market. So that's one aspect. And the second is bilateral and plurilateral cooperation, indeed. Now, bilateral cooperation takes various forms. As I said, the network of free trade agreements that we have and what we inject in them, and this is why implementation of trade agreements is as important from our perspective as simply the negotiation of new trade treaties, is also what enables us to engage on a cooperation basis on all these issues with a whole range of partners. Now, we have, as I mentioned, the Trade and Technology Council with the US, we have a high-level economic dialogue with Japan. We are injecting this discussion about economic security and what it means and how we're making the paradigm shift in all of our bilateral, and in some cases, I'm thinking about the G7, for example, plurilateral frameworks. And third, the multilateral level and multilateral cooperation for us plays a big role in this. Why? Because we believe that we need to maintain a universal set of guardrails against a shift away from rules-based international economic relation towards perhaps something which is going to be much more akin to power-based international economic relations. And for us, the WTO is central to this. A reformed WTO, by the way, because I would agree that we are in this because we want to make sure that we have a WTO that is fit for purpose. On this, we're making proposals. For example, we are proposing to discuss these issues of industrial policies in the WTO setting. It's important that the WTO remains a convener for people, members, to be able to discuss these issues and provide a framework for cooperation. And for us, that's very important because if we have rules, if we have institutions that are effective and that provide that guardrail, well, this increases, in our view, our resilience and economic security at the end of the day. So definitely, again, working at various levels with various partners in a very open manner.
Anahita?
From a company's perspective, of course, no one questions that the European Union should and must have their own toolbox, their own laws But if you are a global company, if you just look at the economic sanctions landscapes, for example, you have the EU laws, you have the UK law, you have the US law, you have the Japanese, you have the Australian, and then every single set of law naturally is different. But especially if you also want to look into circumvention issues, you need more coordination, you need more dialogue, you need more cooperation. And I think especially the United States and the European Union need actually more instead of less.
We have about 5 minutes for questions. Do we have any from the audience? Right over here.
Hello, my name is Noah Barkin. I'm with Rhodium Group and the German Marshall Fund. I'd like to press Denis Redonnet for a bit more details on the rationale behind the anti-subsidy investigation into Chinese EVs. We only have a sentence in the European Commission President's State of the Union speech so far in terms of details. And I think the interesting thing is that if you look at the import data, you probably wouldn't say that Chinese EVs from China are flooding into the European market. Now, they are growing at a rapid pace, and perhaps this is a sign that the Commission is taking a more proactive, preemptive approach to trade defense. I'd be keen to understand if Mr. Redonnet, if you feel that's the case. Thank you.
Denis, go ahead.
Sure. Look, we are at the stage of initiating an investigation. We will see what the investigation yields. Now, if we initiate an investigation, it's because we believe the standards for initiation of that kind of trade policy, trade remedy instrument is met. It is a fact, a matter of fact, that we believe that there are significant subsidization schemes benefiting this exporting sector in China, and that will be the subject of our further work in investigation. We see a very rapid acquisition of market share, notably by Chinese brands on the EU market. There is significant capacity in China, and there is a lot of market evidence that there is a great buildup of capacity. And the EU market, for the time being, is one of the most open markets, because many other markets are much more closed to imports. So there's a set of factual elements there that has led the Commission to decide to initiate an investigation. I don't think there's much more I will say or can say at this stage, because again, we are at the stage of starting an anti-subsidy investigation. It's not a change in logic, it is the application of a well-established WTO-sanctioned instrument that we have the capacity and the means to use when we are faced with an objective situation to which it corresponds. Maybe that enables me, and I'll just finish with this, to say that we have a panoply, and it's true that the toolbox has been expanded over the last few years to deal with the new realities that we are confronting, complex level playing field distortions, new types of egregious practices, for example, recourse to economic coercion, which we think is an extremely worrying development in terms of international relations. And as a result, we have developed the toolbox, but again, on a certain number of principles. I mean, number one, we need to use different tools for different problems and not conflate everything. We have level playing field tools. We have tools that relate to security, essential security. We have tools that relate to sovereignty. For example, the statute that we've put in place with respect to economic coercion. We are using the tools for the different objectives, and we are not mixing up tools. And in no way do these tools correspond to any sort of shift towards being more closed, more protectionist, more artificially defensive vis-à-vis the rest of the world, because it is in our fundamental interest to remain essentially a trading and investment bloc that operates on the basis of openness with rules. That has not changed because that is our structural interest as European Union.
All right, well, unfortunately, we're going to have to leave it there so that we can move on to Ambassador Tai. But thank you, all of our three panelists, both in person and remotely, for a very important and interesting conversation late in the day. So thank you all.